Our next speaker is Dr. George Waldbusser. He's a researcher and professor at Oregon State University, whose research projects range from estuarine biogeochemistry to invertebrate responses to climate change. George is going to discuss what it means to be an active researcher, educator, and science communicator in a rapidly changing world with differing views of science. And so, George, I see you've started your video, so you can go ahead and share your screen and begin your presentation.
Great. Thank you, Lindsay. Thanks everybody for showing up and being curious today. So as Lindsay said, I'm a professor at Oregon State University. Actually, I taught one of Lindsay's classes that she took with me many years ago now, and it's sort of great to, one of the great things about my job is to see great students like Lindsay come through different programs, come to class, and then move on in their careers. So the other thing, other part of my job that is more recent is as of about a year ago, I'm the director of the Ocean Earth Atmospheric Sciences graduate program, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So I wanted to give you a timeline of how I became a scientist, and so I promised there would be some pictures from my youth, and so this is me at about 11 years old in a school play as George Washington. And then this is in the late 80s, my buddy's really nice hot rod car, and this was sort of the style of the time. And so the funny thing is you're gonna look back at your photos of you now in 30 years and wonder how you could have been so dorky. And then this is, again, my friend Greg going all the way back. And the really neat thing about this is went to the same school, we spent a lot of time together. Greg never went to college. He was a successful business person. He started a couple different businesses, moving and various things, and we still stay in touch to this day. So at the core of it, how I ended up becoming a scientist is that I've always been curious about how things work. Whether it was cars, there was a story from my childhood of taking apart a lawnmower, which then I couldn't get back together, but I was just fundamentally curious at how it worked. But I always wanted to understand how things work. I thumbed through we had the old encyclopedia books as a kid before the internet, and I used to just thumb through that. And the thing that I think is sometimes surprising is, as a professor, is to think back and realize I was never really a great student. I was sort of a solid B student all through school, and I think it has to do with sort of learning and inspiration and what you want to do. And so I think there's this notion that in order to get into the scientist sort of realm, you have to be this sort of straight A perfect student, but it takes a number of different traits and characteristics. Clearly, you can't fail your classes, and you should be striving to all be great students, but that just wasn't me through high school even. In high school, or after high school, actually I left, graduated in 1990, and I spent one semester in a mechanical engineering program at the New York Institute of Technology. I grew up and was raised right outside New York City. I didn't really feel like that's what I wanted to do, so I went for a semester of business classes at community college and realized that isn't really what I wanted to do either. And so I actually took about 5 years off and worked in a union job as an operating engineer. And this was one of two different power plants I worked at during that time. And it was really kind of interesting place. It was being built when I started there. It's brand new, and it was a waste energy facility. And so it would take actually trash and burn that and generate electricity. And it really sort of kind of piqued my curiosity about environmental issues and so on, and seeing the stream of trash that was generated, where I lived, and how that was turned into energy was really kind of neat. So after about 5 years of doing that, and I worked at a heating and air conditioning plant at a hospital for a while too, I ended up going back to university. I went to St. John's University in Queens in New York City, and I majored in environmental science. And Megan mentioned these kind of opportunities and internships, and so I did sort of the same thing. I realized that I wanted to get some research experience or work in a lab or have some hands-on sort of opportunities to learn stuff. And so one day I decided to go knock on the door of a professor who taught botany at St. John's, and he wasn't there that day. And so I went next door and knocked on the door of the benthic ecology guy and started doing work in benthic ecology. And I still think back to that moment as this wonder if I would have ever become an oceanographer if the guy who was the botanist was around that day. So it's sort of interesting how these opportunities arise and where the paths sort of lead you in different ways. But, all of this sort of led me to, sort of my hobbies of backpacking and surfing and interest in the environment and how systems worked, working at the waste energy plant, all led me to seek out a career path that I really just wanted to leave the planet a little bit better than it was when I arrived. And so that is sort of one of the core of my motivations of what I do. So part of this timeline, so moving forward, so I worked in the lab of a benthic ecologist. I did work on freshwater invertebrates. And so we did surveys of the different bugs that lived in freshwater streams. I got involved with research on wetlands restoration and looking at how communities respond to that. And so then I eventually got into grad school pretty much right after my undergrad. This is me at University of Connecticut. One of the first research cruises I was on, we were studying mercury and sediments throughout Long Island Sound and New York Harbor. And then this is me as a PhD student. And my work really had kept me really close to shore. And so I always like to joke that I have an oceanography degree, but really most of the research nearly all the research in my dissertation involved walking or driving to my field sites because I really worked in a lot of intertidal areas. So this was me collecting sediment cores out in the coastal bays of Virginia, looking at kind of how organisms change sediment biogeochemistry. And then this was me as a postdoc before I became a professor, and sort of doing a sort of short video thing for the National Science Foundation about work on hard clams we were doing and ocean acidification. So these are little juvenile hard clams back there. So that was me through trajectory through grad school, and then and I became a professor at OSU in 2009. So this is one of my earlier photos of me and my lab group, actually at the Marine Science Day at Hatfield Science Center. This was me lightning one of our long experiments we were running, and we had several students in the lab late at night, and I was there helping out. And then this was actually some outreach work I was doing in Salem several years ago. And you'll notice there seems to be this common theme of plaid and funny hats. So why do I do it besides the goofy hats and the plaid? Well, so what I do at OSU is I get to conduct scholarly research, which means I write research proposals to funding agencies and secure money to support the research, and then we publish papers about that. We communicate those findings to different stakeholder groups in some cases. Since I've been at OSU, I think I've been involved with or raised over $8 million in external funding that has come in and supported a number of different students in my lab and other labs. I get to do a lot of teaching, education, and mentoring. I teach primarily at the graduate level. There's a lot of education and mentoring I do in the lab. I have both graduate students and undergrads who work in the lab with me, who get hands-on experience, who I sort of help advise and help them figure out how to do science and work through problems. And then another part of my job is service. And that includes to the college and serving on committees or the university, also to the scientific community. I work as an editor at a couple different scientific journals, and that's mostly volunteer work. I get a small, they give me a couple $100 a year for that. It doesn't compensate you for time, but then also service to the public. And so doing events like this or public speaking events is all part of what I'm expected to do or what I do as a professor. To give you a sort of slightly different flavor, as a graduate program director, the things I do is manage our graduate admissions process. And so I sort of oversee all the admissions and sort of evaluation of applications and so on to our program, which gets about 150 to 150 applications a year. And we end up accepting about 10 students into the grad program every year. I coordinate teaching assignments. I do other academic program tasks. Get to do some strategic planning for the program. I listen to complaints for things that I do and don't have any control over. So when you get into those positions of being in charge, you end up hearing those things. And the sort of joke is often herding cats and sort of having to sort of try to organize all these independent thinkers and independent folks who work as professors and scientists as part of that job. So my general research areas and interests, I sort of touched on this a bit. My background is really in benthic invertebrate ecology, and so I did a lot of work on sediment biogeochemistry as well, and sort of thinking about and understanding how organisms affect sediment chemistry. For over 10 years now, I've been working on this problem of ocean acidification and how carbon dioxide is changing the chemistry of the ocean, particularly in nearshore environments and on critters that live in shallow systems. And more recently, I've been doing some work on this on and off for sort of figuring out ways that we can counteract acidification by alkalinizing at least small habitats and places in the ocean. One of my really, one of the things that really sort of motivates me is just thinking about seashells. I've always been fascinated by them. I spent a lot of time growing up in Long Island, getting to the beach and being able to sort of comb the beach and look for shells. And it's just fascinating the more I learn about shells, both what they do in the environment and how things make shells. It's really just sort of really cool. And what's hard to appreciate is we don't really even fully understand all the mechanisms of how things make seashells at the really small level, like the sort of interactions between the organic molecules and the minerals. It's really kind of neat. We don't really know that yet. So, just to give you this flavor, the different tools and approaches I use to do this sort of research, or we do laboratory-based studies. And so, Megan, and there were questions about whether or not introverted people could do this sort of work, and actually I would say scientists as a large often are fairly introverted. I think Megan's totally right. It was good advice about learning good people skills, but a lot of times what we do is we spend a lot of time in laboratory settings analyzing samples or running experiments, and often by ourselves or with one or two other people. Do a number of different field measurements and experiments, and then even some mathematical modeling at times, and just sort of using these different tools to really get at the core of the questions that I'm interested in answering. And so why do I do this? And so to me, other than the goofy hats and plaid, what I get to do for a living is satisfy curiosity I have about how the ocean works and how things that live in the ocean function and what they do. And to me, that is really phenomenal when I stop and reflect on it, because there's very few places and jobs that you'll ever have where you're given that sort of intellectual freedom. Where, for me, as a researcher, I can more or less decide what I want to study. I can sort of think about the questions that are really interesting to me and how I figure out how to answer those in ways and utilize the resources that we have available to us to do that. I think that sometimes there's this notion that professors know everything, and it was a great question, and Lindsay addressed it as well, about what happens when you don't know the answer to something. But that's what we get to do as really professors, is we're learning new things before anybody else knows about them. And that's really, to me, one of the most amazing things about being a professor and a researcher, is at that cutting edge of understanding of the way the world works and how things function in the ocean. And then finally, I do have a really strong sense of contribution to society. And I think, especially being at a public university, and most of the funding that supports our research is public research dollars and tax money. And so I have a very strong commitment to trying to use that money in a way that helps us to advance society, both in the education side, training grad students, but also in understanding some answers and approaches to challenge and address these complex issues around climate change and ocean acidification. So, this is I just threw these in here. These are sort of headlines from work we've done or I've been involved with or led about oysters. We've done a lot of work with the West Coast shellfish growers out here and adapting to and addressing ocean acidification. And it's been a really amazing example of being able to take basic research and transmit that to stakeholders who their livelihood depends on being able to grow oysters or aquaculture or even fisheries. We've done work on pink shrimp as well. So all these things, it's a really, really rewarding career. And it's been a long time to get to this point, and it's a lot of hard work to get here. So, and then I just wanted to put this in again because, often getting a PhD, there's this, sometimes people believe it's just you become this little researcher in this really narrow area, but there's plenty of other jobs that you can do with a PhD. One of those that I'm now becoming more familiar with is an administrative role of being a program director. And so what I get to do in that role is I get to help and support our grad students and help them succeed. In doing that, that helps to increase the impact of our research efforts in an active program like ours in OSU. The grad students really are a core of the research endeavor. Part of what I get to do as a program director is try to improve the culture and the community of scientists. We're all part of that community as scientists, and we all have to contribute to it. And being in this position gives me a little bit more ability to help perhaps move the community in different ways or in better ways that we can be better scientists. And really the best part of what I get to do is facilitate and cultivate success, help people be successful and help people move forward and advance. So, and it's really an honor for me. Our graduate program is highly prestigious, and all of our graduates are employed very rapidly, usually within 6 months of finishing their degrees. Our undergrad program was recently ranked #3 in the world for oceanography. And we as a college secure over $40 million a year in external research funding. And so it's really a phenomenal place that I get to work in and be a part of. And what's really, what's really to me, it stops and makes me, when I talk about these things to reflect on is that I never grew up, you saw those pictures of me and my friend Greg who didn't go to college. My parents never went to college. And none of this ever seemed like it was when I was at the age of many of you are now, none of this seemed like it was something that was attainable to me at that time. But the things that I was interested in, the skills that I developed and learned from even working at the power plant, the mechanical skills, all those sorts of things helped to provide the basis for me to move forward in this direction. So what's it like doing research for a living? And it's a big part of my job. It's really hard. It's competitive. It's also collaborative. It's sometimes disappointing, and it's also really fun and rewarding. So there's a lot of ups and downs. Research is, I always say when you're doing research right, there's always failures. And so one of the really hard things about research is when you're trying to push the boundaries and do really good work, you're often doing things that maybe haven't been done before. And so you're trying to figure those things out for the first time, and they often result in failure, and you have to be able to respond and be resilient to those. So you have to be able to have good organizational skills. I manage usually between 4 to 5 research grants at a time. And I've got 3 to 5 graduate students that I'm managing at a time. There's a tremendous amount of focus and resilience that's needed. I mentioned the resilience in terms of dealing with failure and figuring out how do you work around that, but also the focus that's needed and the hard work to sort of stay centered on something and go after this question that you're trying to answer. I mentioned that it rarely works the first time, and I think that's one of the lessons that grad students often hits them really hard when they first come to grad school. And good research takes a long time to do frequently. So it's something you have to commit to and really be sort of motivated and passionate about. So just finally reflecting on sort of what if I didn't become a researcher? How would my life have been different? I would not have been around all these other smart, really interesting, wonderful people. I mean, there's a tremendous, that in itself of having those interactions with people who are so smart, insightful, intelligent is really, really one of the great things about working in academia as a researcher. Megan mentioned travel. I've gotten to travel places I would never have thought I would have been. I'm actually now sit on an advisory panel for a research institute in New Zealand. And so I get to go to New Zealand every other year, and I chair that committee, and sort of we help establish strategy for them and think about ways for them to be more competitive. But I've gotten free flights to places like China and France and the Netherlands and all over the world. It's been really, really wonderful. I wouldn't have been able to maybe touch as many lives as I have. I mentioned Lindsay was in my class. My graduate class I teach is 20 to 30 students a year. And so over the last 10 years, it's been over 200 students, graduate students have come through that class, and seeing them go to other directions and hearing from them and interacting with them after they've sort of started their careers is really amazing. I probably wouldn't have been able to pursue my interest to this degree. I mean, we all can do our hobbies and things in our own time, but I get paid sort of explore and understand the things that I'm really interested in, which is quite phenomenal. You know, the impacts I get to do, I've interacted multiple times with elected officials. I've testified in Congress to the Senate, to Senate subcommittees and House subcommittees on these issues. And I get to talk to the public and people like you and students who are interested in this, and try to encourage you to explore these opportunities and find ways to move forward. So is it for you? I don't know. That's a question you have to ask yourself, but it's I think it's really worth thinking about, and the fact that you're all here listening is really phenomenal. So that's what I got, and I'm going to stop there because we're definitely getting short on time. So I'll maybe I'll stop sharing my screen, and Lindsay
Thank you,
can
George.
direct some questions, I guess.
Yeah, thank you, George. And I really appreciate your approach to your presentation. I appreciate your framework. And so hopefully you've given our participants some things to think about, and just different aspects that your scientific career has brought you, or different things that it's introduced you to. And so on that note, I'm going to go with a question from someone. What's been the most interesting part of your career? I know that might be a tough question.
I mean, it's interesting every day in various ways. Um, you know, the travel is really incredible. I got to go in the last 5 years. I've gotten to go to France and talk to shellfish growers and oyster growers in France. I went to China and gave a plenary talk at a meeting in China and got to talk to Chinese scientists. But also just even the experience of mentoring graduate students is incredibly interesting. And there's a component of that that's fascinating in watching people grow and develop, and trying to facilitate that and help people do that. That's probably still one of the most challenging things. It's still one of the most rewarding because everybody's different and needs different support things. So I've gotten to go, I mean, I did some research as a grad student with my advisor down in the Bahamas, working on stromatolites, which are living rocks that are really rare around the planet. And we got to go sample and look at those things. And so there's so many different aspects, it'd be hard to pick just one. But the fact that, you know, I get to study these things that I'm interested in is probably on a day-to-day basis really, really interesting to me.
Fantastic, George. Thank you. And we actually have a couple of questions that I'm going to combine because they're similar themes. And so I think folks are appreciating your example that you took your lawnmower apart and you didn't quite know how to put it back together. So there's some questions about, you know, how do you overcome the fact that if you're frustrated or disappointed and things not working out, or how do you overcome the fact that you may not feel that you're qualified? So there's two questions I'm combining, and I know that's quite a big question in one. So thanks participants for sticking it out with us.
Yeah, well, so I think part of what that's referred to is the imposter syndrome that is talked about quite a bit for people who go through academia, in the sense of never quite feeling like you know everything that you should know and feeling comfortable with that. So so the way you have to deal with it is I think being somewhat tenacious. So, you know, I never gave up. And when I decided I wanted to go to graduate school, and I applied and did a lot of things Megan said, contacted people, looked for volunteer opportunities. But I never really gave up. And I also sort of tried to find some balance between, this is where I want to go, but let me see where the road takes me. In terms of research, it's I think over time you start to develop a thick skin, and you sort of expect that sometimes things aren't going to work, and the recognition that you can try to fix that or find another way forward. But I think that's a personality thing, and it's, I think, something that doesn't quite get transmitted maybe as much in school as it used to, with the expectation that everybody's an A student all the time. And I mean, a great example of this, I had a student who came, a PhD student who came from Spain to work here, and the university system there is quite different. And so when she first got here, she was talking to other students, and she mentioned to one of them that she had failed calculus the first time she took it, and the other students were sort of floored because they didn't understand how she could have failed calculus once and still gotten into graduate school. And she explained to them that, you know, 80% of the class fails the first time, and that ability to fail and recover is probably one of the most important lessons that I think and personality traits that will help you be successful as a scientist. I mean, I've had another colleague put it as this, there's this notion of what insanity is, and it's doing the same thing and expecting a different outcome. And there's a little bit of that with it too, of that, you tried something and it didn't work, but you got to try it again and change just something a little bit to try to do it better. So I don't know if that covered the whole of it, but
Yeah, you're great, George. It's a complex question. I think what you're saying is perfect, and I echo it.
yeah.
Perseverance, it's just amazing. You're capable of more than you think, and sometimes you don't know that until you put yourself in these situations. So these are great questions, students. And I know it's 5 o'clock, but I'm going to sneak one more in,
Sure, yeah.
and I will say George has agreed to answer questions that we don't get to. So we'll follow up with you, the folks that have questions that we can't get to. But one more quick question, I think it's a great one. Is you mentioned mathematic modeling, or you're using models, right? And so we have someone who's curious of what kind of mathematics apply to your field of work. So we have some math fans on our call.
Yeah, so I am not a good mathematician by any stretch of the imagination, as evidenced by my solid B performance through high school. I certainly did better in college, but mostly, basic differential calculus and a little bit of integrated calculus. But there are colleagues of mine who really do a lot of math, and that's the focus of what they do. A lot of the physical oceanographers do a lot of really high-end math. I think what I do is the math that I do is statistics. I do a lot of statistics. I taught a biostats course as a postdoc, and some of the modeling work I do is often taking other models and figuring out how to apply them to a different scenario. And so sometimes sometimes you get pretty far being clever, and maybe not having this sort of the strong theoretical background, but recognizing that you can take a tool or an approach and apply it differently. And so that has been a lot of the modeling work that I've done, is taking an existing model that does something and learning how to turn it and twist it in a way and put different parameters in there to make it do the thing that you want it to do or need it to do. So that's the extent of it.
Great, George. Thank you so much for your time and for your insight. And participants, great questions. These are fantastic questions that may not be specific to what George does in his job, but the different things that he's learned along the way. It's just great to hear your feedback. And so thank you so much for your time today and for your presentation, and participants for your questions.